Hey y'all, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to check out another one of my videos. Today I'm very excited to be diving into my top 10 spring palettes for 2022. I try to do these seasonal videos every season, and recently I've started to do it where I look back at my previous year and all the top 10 palettes that I named in that video, and I see if there's any really tried and true ones that I still really do love and that weren't beat out from any new palettes that I've tried over the course of a year, and I share those with you, and then I dive into the new palettes that I've discovered over the course of the year since doing the last video. So today we're going to go into the top 10 for 2022, and I was happy to see that I actually have a decent number of new palettes. One of the new palettes is on my eyes today, and yeah, they're just palettes that remind me of spring, so we're going to sit down and we're going to chat about them. I do want to just throw it out there, this is the second time I'm filming this video because I filmed it I think 3 weeks ago as a pre-film video for me to upload when I wasn't going to be able to record, and then I actually left like autofocus on the camera in the entire video. Like my background and me were constantly going in and out of focus, and it was so annoying, so I scrapped it. But it turned out to be a blessing in disguise because the new palette that I'm going to be naming that's on my eyes and I'm going to be naming in this video wasn't shared yet, so I couldn't have shared it or included in this video. But now that I have it and I'm playing with it, I'm like, oh yes, this is definitely a top 10 spring palette for me. But I'm getting ahead of myself there. Let's go ahead, just roll the intro and we can get right into it. Alright, before we dive into the new palettes that I've discovered recently, I do want to go over the palettes that I went in my last video and share with you guys the palettes that are still fantastic palettes, fantastic quality, whatever the case is, they are still tried and true, and in my mind, top 10 when it comes to springtime palettes. The first one is actually not going to be in the top 10. I'm going to put it as an honorable mention because I still really do love it. However, the brand is closing, and I'm not sure at the time of me filming this, you might still be able to get a hold of it, but over the course of the next few months, I'm sure it's going to be harder to get a hold of, so I didn't want to include it in my top 10 since it won't be available for much longer. But that is going to be the Midas Cosmetics Lemonade palette. This palette has such a special place in my heart because it was the first all yellow palette that I loved everything about it, and it just like hit the mark for me. This brown right here gives me enough depth in my look to just be the type of eye looks that I like to get, so I can get a deeper type of outer corner but still really light and bright and very springtime on my eyes. And just, I mean, I just feel like a sunflower anytime I wear this. But because they are discontinuing the brand, I'm putting it in an honorable mention, and probably I won't mention it next year because I'm sure it'll be hard to get available, but I can definitely say this is like my favorite all yellow palette for sure, hands down, and I'm very sad about Midas closing. Last year I also mentioned Poppi Cosmetics Neon Drip palette. This palette, while it's like super vibrant and I feel like some people might see this as more of a summertime palette, I considered it more of a springtime palette because if you're new around here, I'm someone who I love depth, and the one time that I feel like I'm okay not having too much depth in a look or just being very light and like no depth in the outer corner is when it comes to spring. So with this palette, they're so light and bright and beautiful. They're still very neon-ish, but they are, as a rule across the board, pretty light. You can't really get any depth because there is just no deep colors. Even this color that looks rather deep is more of a duochrome type of shade that looks very light when you use it. So this palette, in my opinion, has no depth, but I'm okay using it. It's beautiful. The quality is fantastic. The colors and the looks that you can get, they're so neon and bright on your eyes, and I love it for the spring because, as I said, that's like the one season where it's like, okay, I'm okay not having too much depth. Although I do realize as I'm saying that I have like a really black lip, but that's another way I can get away with like not too much depth on my eyes. Like I put on a really dark black lip and it's still, there's the depth for me, a little bit of grunge. But anyway, yeah, this palette is just so very fun. It's a fantastic quality, fantastic, like the sparkles are just so pretty. I remember having so much fun with this palette. Oh, this reminds me of the shade I have on my lid right now. But anyway, a great palette. This was the brand's first launch and I was super impressed with it. I've been keeping my eye on the brand ever since, but this still kind of reigns supreme for me when it comes to the brand Poppi Cosmetics as like their best launch, and I just love it so much. When it comes to springtime, it's a great palette. Next up, if you are not new around here, I'm sure you assume that this one was carrying over, but this is the Give Me Glow Pastel Dreams palette. You guys know how much I love this palette. This palette, I've said it many times and I'll say it again here, but this is my #1 pastel palette. If you want to know my recommendation when it comes to what would be a good pastel palette I would recommend, is this palette because it gives you every single color in the rainbow. It gives you a matte and shimmer version of that color, and it's like, what else could you ask for? And on top of the great color story to give you one palette when it comes to pastels in your set, I also absolutely love the matte formula and the shimmer formula of Give Me Glow Cosmetics shadows. It's just fantastic. Their shimmers are just the most, this is my favorite one. Yes, I'm in a very yellowy green mood, but they're so sparkly. They're very metallic, very easy to put on your eyes. You're super effortless to put on. And then all of the mattes in here are very pigmented. You know, they are very soft because they are pastel, but these are like pigmented pastels. So they're not a pastel that you put on and you're like, wait, I think I see a hint of color on my lid. No, these pop up and they show as their pastel colors, and they just take very little work. And yeah, they're just one of my favorite palettes. I think Give Me Glow did a fantastic job with this, hit it out of the park, and it's once again gonna stay in my top 10 for spring. This is the definitely the first palette I think of whenever I'm going like, okay, top 10 for spring. What palettes do I love? This I feel like is forever gonna stay in the top 10 because it's such a good pastel palette. Another palette I mentioned last year, this is the I Heart Revolution Tasty Avocado palette. And this one I mentioned as like a grungy pastel palette that I loved for spring, and I can still see it and I still do agree with it. I had the opportunity to play with it not, you know, too many months ago, and I was using it and I was like, oh yeah, like the mattes in here are really, really nice. And I also really enjoyed the shimmers in here. I think my only con with this palette is that some of the shimmers are a little bit repetitive. I feel like they, you know, you could have had one or the other. You didn't need both in the palette. But even that aside, I do really like this palette. I think the quality is nice. And like I said, it's a very grungy because you can get a little depth up there with, you know, this green here. And then, you know, the color story as a whole has a little bit of grunge to it, but it is as a whole very light and airy, and in my opinion, is a grungy spring palette. So when I was creating looks with this palette, like each time I create a look, it's like, yes, it's green, yes, it's got that grunge, but it's got a very light look to it that made me think of spring. So I had to keep it in my top 10 when it comes to spring because you guys know I'm a green lover, so I always like to have all green palettes or all grungy green. This isn't a totally green palette, but you know, I like to have green palettes in my, you know, top videos because I love green so very much, and this is definitely a fantastic palette. And it's like I Heart Revolution, you know, you can get it at Ulta, you can get it on sale, and it's the one palette I've tried so far for My Heart Revolution that I'm just like, yes, that's a winner. This is a good palette. Next up is going to be another all pastel palette. This is from Menagerie. This is the Pastel Pup palette. And before we get into the palette, look at this cute and adorable packaging. Like, so cute. I always love Menagerie's palette packaging. But anyway, getting into the palette, it is an all pastel palette with one black, and that is just so very fun and interesting. Kind of like the look I have on today. It's like all pastel, but it has a black lip and the black wing. I felt like just, I don't know, I feel like it complemented it, and it was very light and airy, but still, like I said, still like pastel, but me. And this palette is kind of in the same vein of that. It's very pastelish, but I love that you had that black to either pack on the outer corner and get a really dark black with a ton of pastels, you know, in the crease and on the lid, or you could, you know, just take a dab of black and mix it in and just kind of get different type of looks and a little bit of depth mixed with all the pastels. And then it did have one shimmer that was like an icy blue, but it also shifted a little bit, and it was just beautiful. Went with whatever type of look that you created with this palette. And this palette, like the mattes are so very nice. Menagerie's mattes formula is very, very nice. And while it is pastel and light, it's again that type of pastel formula that it shows up. I've tried so many pastel palettes where it's like you put it on and it's like, I can't even really see it against my complexion. My complexion just like eats it up or just makes it disappear. I don't know what the case is, but I can't see the pastel color. But this palette, when you create a look with it, it's not just like, oh, I see like a hint of wash of like a really light purple on there. No, it's like, oh, you have a pastel purple on your eye. It's beautiful. And that's what I love when it comes to my pastels in springtime. I like them to pop and show up and not be too light and kind of washed out color. That's not my preference. So this is a palette that gives me the pigment while still giving me pastels, and I love it. Another palette that gives me like the pastels but a little bit of depth and grunge is the LA Girl Mainstage Desert Dreams palette. I named this as a top 10 last year, and it's still a fantastic palette. I had to keep it in for this year as well, if I can open this, sorry. But this palette, it's a little, I feel like a little controversial, because when you look at this palette, it's like, you got a lot of depth over here, Katie. Like, are you sure that's a pastel palette? However, when I play in it, all the looks that I created, they're very light and they're very bright, and they just remind me of spring, but they have an interesting mix to them with the deeper tones, with mixing it in with all these lighter tones up here that, well, for whatever the case is, the looks that I created always made me think of springtime and just all the bright colors and whatnot. So it's a palette that when I created looks, I definitely think of spring. So it's staying in my top 10 for spring palettes. And if you maybe don't like as much depth, I mean, you could just stay over here for starters. But also it's a great summer palette because it's got so many fun, bright colors, but it's got the depth in there, and you can really, you know, pack these on and get a lot of really intense depth that is very, very beautiful. So it's been a favorite of mine. I feel like I've mentioned in so many videos ever since I tried it at the beginning of last year, I think. and it's still a good one. It's so good. The matte formula is so easy to work with, so beautifully pigmented and like just intense. Like look at that matte. It's a beautiful matte. And then the shimmers, like they're very lightly pressed, I guess, or very just soft. So you definitely have to be careful because you could definitely, I mean, I made quite a mess of my palette, but they're beautiful. Like, oh my goodness, they are so beautiful. I know I'm starting to touch them, but this is my favorite shimmer in the palette. I feel like my finger swatches don't do it justice, but trust me, it is beautiful on the eyes. And I've used this palette numerous times on my channel. So if you want to go search it up and look for a video, you can see it live in action. I love this palette and definitely had to keep it in my top 10 for spring. The last palette that I mentioned last year that I thought was such high quality and such an amazing spring palette that I'm carrying it over for this year is the Playing in Makeup by Yolondo Jamrock Colored Wasashini Pastel Eyeshadow Palette. No one's ever corrected me on this, so I think I'm mostly saying it right, but if I'm saying this word incorrectly, I am so sorry. I always am stumbling over words. That's nothing new around here. This palette right here, obviously pastel palette, obviously makes me think of spring, and the quality of this palette is fantastic, so I definitely had to mention it and recommend it as one of my top 10 when it comes to springtime palettes. This palette has so many different color options when it comes to pastel colors that just make you think of spring. They're all very intense and vibrant. Again, they're that type of pastel where, I mean, some of them are a little bit lighter where it's going to be kind of like, oh, I can barely see it. So if you like that lighter wash of color, you can definitely get it with this palette. I'm kind of thinking up in this category. You can build them up, but you're definitely like very light transition shades. However, I mean, it's a large palette. It has a lot of shades down here that are just super intense. Like this hot pink one, it's very intense. It's green, the orange, there's enough color in there that these lighter tones work really well to help blend out the deeper tones and just give such a beautiful type of pastel, very bright and airy and light type of colors. And there is a little bit of depth down here as well. It's not like super deep and dark like I tend to like when it comes to really deepening up my outer crease. That's kind of why I definitely think of this as a springtime palette, because that's the one occasion, I know I've already said it, but that's when I don't mind going a little lighter, when it's kind of spring and, you know, just making me think of spring or more of a springtime look that I'm going for. And this palette can definitely give it to you, but this purple can go pretty dark, so I was really happy about that. But yeah, lots of color options. For me, with this palette specifically, the quality of the mattes really impressed me. The shimmers, I honestly wasn't too impressed. I like these two. Maybe it's because of the color, but also the formula was very easy to use, whereas the other colors were very light and more of like a not like a top coat, but like a translucent type of shimmer. Very sheer wash of color with sparkle to it, a lot of these were. And I mean, that's pretty, but it's just not what I was looking for. So maybe, you know, if that's what you like, as I was saying, that'll be right up your alley. But for me, these two had enough color, like impact to them to be able to tell like, oh yeah, you have a really nice pastel green on your lid or pastel orange on your lid, and it was very pretty and stood out for me. But yeah, overall a fantastic palette option. And I mean, it's such a large palette too. This is another palette that you could get if you wanted to get one and done type to have pastels in your collection. This is a great way to go because you would have tons to choose from with this palette. Okay, now diving into the new palettes that I've discovered since doing last year's video that make me think of spring. The first one is going to be Kaleidos Flower Punk Palette. I feel like this might be a little bit surprising. I don't know. You guys can let me know. Sometimes I look at stuff and I'm like, that's not typically what I see when people talk about their spring palettes, but this for me definitely made me think of spring. When I was using it and creating looks with it, there's so many fun and interesting combinations that you could do with between the pastel shades up here and these grungy shades down here that it was so interesting. And it's like a pastel grunge type of spring palette. And with this palette specifically, like you have a darker color down here, but in my opinion, it's not like a super intense, a very, very dark outer corner. So again, it's one of those kind of mid-tone dark outer corners in my mind that makes me think of more springy type of looks. And yeah, so that's a big reason why I'm putting it in this category as a springtime palette. But as I said, it's like spring with grunge, and the color combinations, the looks that I did with this, I just recently reviewed this. So if you want to watch my palette palooza, I'll leave it linked in one of these sides. And if you watch that palette palooza, when I talk about this palette specifically, I'll share all the looks that I did when I was you know, using and testing this palette out, and you can see the looks. And for me personally, they all have that like very light wash of color with the dark grunge and the dark, you know, this dark rich greeny grunge that I absolutely love. I love the combination. I had so much fun with this palette, and yeah, that's why I have to put it as one of my spring palettes. And the mattes in here are really nice to use. I had a little bit of trouble with this darker one, but nothing terrible. I could definitely make it work. And the shimmers in here, I was just amazed at how beautiful and how much they stood out, because each one of these is like a super intense, you know, very obvious color of, you know, like a green gold, and then this is a pink, and then this is like a pastel green. However, the shimmer and the sparkle that they put within all of those shimmers is a different color, so it makes the shimmer and the sparkle stand out even more, and it just makes your eye look just a little bit more special and a little bit more beautiful, and I really did appreciate it and thought it was so very beautiful. They're very messy to use, very messy to apply and whatnot, but definitely worth it. And yeah, I had to name it as one of my top 10 for spring palettes. Next up is going to be Lethal Cosmetics and Theresa is Dead, Lethal is Dead palette. This palette right here, I had a lot of fun using. I feel like I say that every time. I had a lot of fun using it. I'm sorry if like the things I say sometimes get a little bit repetitive. Anyway, this palette was a lot of fun. I really did enjoy it, but kind of the vein with these palettes, I'm sure you're seeing by now, is there isn't a lot of depth to the palettes, and they have more light and bright looks, and those type of palettes just make me think of spring when I'm creating looks on my eyes, and this one definitely did. A little bit more of like a grunge, or maybe like a grayed out, or like a gray added to the pastel colors, so it kind of deepens them a little bit and gives me more of a unique type of grayed out, grungy type of pastel look, but still in my mind makes me think of spring, so I definitely had to mention this palette is fantastic. I have no idea if it's still available. It is a collab with Theresa is Dead, but if you are able to get it, maybe they're going to keep the singles. That would be an option too, but I really did enjoy it and thought it was just, it's a very unique type of pastel palette that I have in my collection, and I really did enjoy it. If you're brand new to Lethal Cosmetics, I really do enjoy their matte formula. It's very easy to work with, very like beginner friendly too when it comes to like color. The shimmers in here I just thought were very light, and they were so light when it came to the color that it almost, one almost looked like the other, especially between these two and maybe even these two, but they're so very light it's almost like I couldn't tell the color on my lid. I just could tell I had a light pastel type of shimmer shade. Still very beautiful. I'm sure that was the intent of the color, but for me personally, you guys know I like intense color, a broken record. But anyway, it's fantastic for spring. I really did enjoy it, and the quality overall is just very nice, and definitely recommend and love for spring. All right, this next one might be a little bit of a cheat, but I'm going to be mentioning two palettes. However, they're in the same collection from the same brand. That's how I'm getting away with it. But anyway, this is from Playing in Makeup by Yolanda, and this is from her, I believe it's called Infinity Collection, but this is the Expression palette. I'll open it up so you guys can actually see. Expression palette, and then this one is the Mixture. I almost dropped the palettes. This one is the Mixture palette. So Expression and Mixture palette. This one is a little dark, especially when you look at the shimmer. So for my purposes of this video, I feel like if I black out the shimmer in here, because it is so deep, if we focus on these colors, I see this as a beautiful springtime palette, and I'm gonna go ahead and put a picture in the video right now. This is the look that I created with the Mixture palette for the first time I did this, my top 10 for spring palettes of 2022, and I created that look specifically for my spring palette video because I thought it would just kind of showed how great this palette is when it comes to spring type of looks. It's very intense, it's a little bit deeper, gives a lot of depth if you want to. I love a lot of depth, so I don't mind it, but the top two colors, especially as you mix them into looks, I definitely thought of spring when I was creating looks with it, so hence why I'm putting it in this video. And then the Expressions palette, I feel like as a whole is just a great, very spring monochromatic palette. It is fantastic. Both of these palettes, quality, I already talked to you guys a little bit at the beginning of the video, you know, with the pastel palette, talking about the quality, but I feel like she's definitely stepped up her game with these palettes. These are her most recent launch, I believe, and oh my goodness, the pigmentation of these mattes, fantastic. The way they blend into each other and blend out, fantastic. And the shimmers, even this one that I'm hiding because it's not very like springy, but the shimmers, oh my goodness, the shimmers are beautiful. I did 2 videos using these. I think one of these in each video, I can't even remember, but I did a live stream where I, created looks with them, one on each eye type of thing, and I was just blown away by how intensely pigmented, how easy they were to work with, how, beautiful they look. The shimmers were so beautiful on the lid. They show up no problem. This one has like a shift to it as well, as does this one, I think. They're beautiful, they're special, they're stunning, and they're not that expensive. I want to say they're around the $15 mark. I did get it on sale. I waited for a 40% off coupon that she has not infrequently, so definitely would be a way to go, to make them even more affordable, but still, as is, such great quality, such fantastic, intensely pigmented shadows. Had to mention them in today's video, and both of these I feel like are very springy type palettes. All right, last one, and as I said, it's what's on my eyes, so if you haven't checked the description box already to kind of sneak peek yourself, because I always mention down there what's on my eyes, I'll show you guys now, but this is the new Nomad Paradise Islands palette. I know this is a bit of a cheat because this is exactly the 3rd look that I've done with this palette, so it's very, very new, but I am very familiar with Nomad's quality of their eyeshadows, both their shimmers and their mattes, and as I've said, I've done 3 looks with it, so I've kind of played around. I will continue to do more looks. I will continue to give a full in-depth review, but I couldn't not mention it in this video when it comes to my top 10 spring palettes for 2022 because it's just such a great spring palette. I know it's very summery too, but the more I play with it and I've been, you know, creating looks with it, I'm like, I feel like it's more for me personally spring because again, with this palette, there isn't a ton of depth. And I think that's something for me when it comes to summer. I enjoy color, I enjoy intense bold color, but I like depth as well when it comes to spring. The only time, as I said, that I'm cool, you know, just using very light or, you know, no depth on the outer corner is for spring. So the more I use this, while these two shades are pretty deep, they don't go incredibly deep for me, and I always like a little bit more depth. Like, they don't get anything super intense, but they are still, you know, give a little bit of depth, and therefore I feel like I like this palette more because it gives me a little bit of depth, but a ton of lighter colors. I was able to create a really light and bright and very spring type of look on my eyes today. I feel like yesterday also I used it, and I felt like the look there was very spring appropriate and very just sunny and bright. So yeah, I had to mention this as my top 10 for spring because I am enjoying it so very much. The matte quality is so very nice. They're very easy to use. They show up pretty, you know, effortlessly when it comes to blending them out on my eyes, and I haven't had a single problem, you know, with any kind of creasing, weird patching, you know, blending together, anything like that. And then the shimmers are beautiful. Nomad tends to do like a mixture of their shimmers where like some of these, like this shade and this shade, are almost, you know, metallic and foiled looking. They're so intense and so beautiful. And then they have other ones that are more like a sheer wash of color, and I think that's beautiful too, and I'm sure people will like that versatility in the palette. So as a whole, once again, Nomad did a fantastic job and created such a pretty palette. And yeah, I'm really excited to continue creating some more looks, some more springtime looks for me that make me think of spring. And yeah, I know it's super new, and I feel like I tend to not do palettes that are this new, but I'm making an exception for this palette because it's just so springtime appropriate. I had to mention in my top 10 for spring. Alright, so that's going to do it for my top 10 for spring palettes for 2022. So many fun palettes. I always love sitting down and being able to chat with you guys about them. I am so glad you guys tend to enjoy these type of videos, and I look forward to these kind of, you know, seasonal videos because it's always fun to kind of think of what palettes make me think of the season that we're in this case spring, and kind of see what rises to the top and what's my top 10. So even though I had to do this video twice, I still really did enjoy getting to sit down and chat with you guys about these palettes, and I hope you guys did enjoy that. And yeah, I think that's gonna do it for me. I can keep this outro pretty short and sweet. Per usual, I'm over on Instagram. I'm LadyKatie92 over there. I took quite a long break because some things were going on in my life. It was a little chaotic, and I just did not have time for YouTube or Instagram, but I'm getting back to it. Gonna try to be uploading more reels and up close eye pictures, all that sort of thing. And I also need to film kind of like a life update to chit chat with you guys and just share what's going on, because it has been a little while. A lot's been happening, and it would just be nice to be able to, you know, share with you guys what's going on and kind of what the future may or may not hold. But anyway, that's gonna do it for me. Thank you once again so much for watching, and I will see you guys very soon in my next video. Bye guys.